married at 14, dead at 24. Claude of France was not a queen of power, but of sacrifice. 7 children in 9 years, her body torn apart for a crown she never truly wore. No glory, no monument, just silence. She died of infection after her final childbirth, alone, discarded, and quickly replaced. History remembers her title, not her tears. This is the life they buried with Claude. She was born into a cradle carved from 2 thrones, one gilded by the fleur-de-lis of the French Valois, the other anchored in the fierce independence of Brittany, a duchy that had resisted the swallowing hunger of royal annexation for generations. But despite being the living union of 2 powerful bloodlines, Claude of France was never celebrated as a triumph of dynastic strategy. Rather, she was received like a sigh, a quiet disappointment cloaked in lace, simply because she was born a girl. From the moment she opened her eyes on the 13th of October, 1499, at the royal chateau of Romorantin, Claude was more burden than blessing in the eyes of her father, King Louis XII, whose every hope had been pinned on a male heir. An heir who would have secured the fragile line of succession and cemented the Valois grip on a throne forever plagued by rival claims and fragile treaties. But Claude, wrapped in the soft cotton of royal infancy, had none of the value they had prayed for, at least not the kind that could wield a sword or wear a crown. Her mother, Anne of Brittany, was one of the most powerful women of her time. Twice crowned Queen of France, once married to Charles VIII, and after his death, to his cousin Louis XII, a woman who fought tooth and nail to keep Brittany autonomous and unassimilated, a duchess in her own right, who ruled with a mind sharper than many men of court, yet also a mother whose love was measured and cold. As if she feared tenderness would soften the political edges she had so painstakingly forged over a lifetime of negotiation, exile, and return. Anne loved Brittany more than any child, and certainly more than Claude. And so the little girl who should have been a miracle, who should have been adored for being born of such illustrious lineage, grew up not in adoration, but in expectation. Raised like a ledger to be balanced, a pawn to be placed, a girl to be married off the moment she became useful, never once asked if she wished to be anything more than an obedient daughter, to a mother whose affections were locked behind fortress walls of diplomacy and bitterness. Her earliest memories were of cold hands adjusting the folds of her gown, of nurses whispering about her crooked spine, of priests murmuring prayers over her fragile body, and of long corridors where footsteps echoed louder than any laughter. For Claude, small, quiet, and already marked by a curvature of the back that would haunt her image for centuries, was not a child to be paraded, but to be prepared. And the preparations began almost from the cradle. Louis XII, meanwhile, had his eyes fixed on remarriage once Anne was gone, desperate for a second chance at producing a male heir. And Claude, whose existence had not solved that dynastic crisis, was never truly seen as his legacy, only as the next logistical step in maintaining one. Even as a toddler, Claude's name was bartered across Europe, her hand promised and unpromised like a diplomatic coin to be traded for peace. First offered to Charles of Austria, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Then retracted when French politics shifted, and Anne of Brittany fought to keep her daughter aligned with Breton interests rather than Habsburg ones. But these arguments were never Claude's to win or even understand. She was merely the parchment upon which alliances were drawn, erased, and redrawn. She lived most of her early years within the walls of the Château de Blois, a place of rare beauty but colder still, its stained glass casting brilliant colors on stone floors that never warmed her feet, its gardens perfectly trimmed yet devoid of joy, and its halls filled with courtiers who saw in her only potential or failure, but never humanity. Anne's vision was to keep Brittany sovereign through Claude, if not as Duchess, then at least as the vessel through which Breton blood might survive French conquest. But that dream began to collapse when the girl's fate was sealed not by her mother's will, but by the inevitability of French inheritance, and most painfully, by the king's decision to marry Claude to his heir, Francis of Angoulême, the teenage boy whose future would become the axis of the French Renaissance and whose charm masked a hunger far more ravenous than any battlefield. Claude was betrothed to him at barely 11 years old. By 14, she was married. The crown was in sight. But it came with no garland of roses, no promise of personal sovereignty, only chains and silk. No one asked the girl in the violet dress if she was afraid. No one noticed how tightly her fingers clenched the edge of her sleeves. The wedding ceremony, held in Saint-Germain-en-Laye in May 1514, was a spectacle meant to distract the court from Anne's death and the brewing anxieties about Brittany's fate. But behind the embroidered curtains, Claude was led like an offering to the altar, not to a god, but to a dynasty. And so began her transformation from child of power to instrument of policy, from daughter to queen consort in waiting, a role that offered her no voice in court, no seat in council, and no say in her own fate. From the moment she said yes, Claude became a shadow beside his son. A girl barely 14, a wife in title, a mother in training, a political answer to a national question. And though the court smiled and toasted and the clergy blessed the union, none of them would remember the way she looked when she turned away from the altar, small, solemn, and already fading. Because Claude of France was not born to live. She was born to serve, to carry, to endure. And in that endurance, the tragedy of a queen had already begun. Quietly, like a candle left to burn down in a room no one returned to, Claude of France did not fall in love. She was placed like a cornerstone in a crumbling foundation, a living truce between ambitions far older than her and rivalries far colder than anything a child could understand. She was thrust into marriage not because she had reached womanhood, she hadn't, but because the clock of kingdoms demanded it, and her bloodline, though wrong in gender, was right in geography, perfect for binding together what her mother had spent a lifetime trying to keep apart. It was a bitter irony that Anne of Brittany, who had devoted her entire reign to keeping Brittany independent, refusing to let it dissolve into the belly of France like so many duchies before, was now forced to surrender her daughter to the very man she despised. Francis of Angoulême, a Valois cousin raised far from court, known more for his pride and appetite than for any noble restraint. A boy who represented everything Anne had tried to shield her duchy from, and yet, in a final defeat that tasted like ash, she was compelled to accept the match because Louis XII had made it law. Law, not choice. Power, not feeling. And Claude, who stood barely taller than the altar candles at her wedding, with wrists too thin for the golden bangles gifted by foreign ambassadors, was not marrying for herself, not even for her father, but for the unspoken war between a mother's hope and a monarch's will. A war fought with parchment, not swords, and lost in silence. From the moment the betrothal was declared irrevocable, Claude's life became an itinerary. Her days filled with Latin lessons and court etiquette and rehearsals for a throne she would never truly sit on, not as a sovereign, but as an ornament. Claude was drilled in piety, in decorum, in the art of listening without speaking, smiling without warmth, standing still without breaking under the weight of silks and expectation, because everyone knew she would soon be queen. But no one expected her to lead, only to follow, quietly, and carry children like coins in a purse whose seams were already fraying. She was 14 when they dressed her in white and placed the crown of consort-in-waiting upon her brow. 14 when they told her to kneel and swear loyalty to a future she had never chosen. 14 when Francis took her hand, not with tenderness, but with triumph in his eyes, knowing that in marrying her, he had secured not only the crown, but the vast lands of Brittany. A duchy whose riches would soon fill his treasury, whose identity would dissolve into his own. And in that moment, Claude became both bride and conquest. She was led through corridors like a veiled relic. The queen-to-be who spoke little, moved gently, and carried the heavy silence of a girl already fading into her role. And though the tapestries were grand and the trumpets celebratory, no one could hear the thudding quiet of her heart, or see the way she turned her face slightly from the crowd, as if shielding herself from the weight of so many watching eyes. Francis, only a year older, was the darling of the court. Handsome, tall, already charismatic in a way that made older men uneasy and young women dream without caution. And though his marriage to Claude was politically brilliant, it was personally dismissive, because while he respected her bloodline, he never respected her spirit, if he even noticed she had one. He liked the crown she gave him. He liked the land she brought him. But he never loved the girl. From the beginning, Francis chased light, chased fame, chased beauty with the same recklessness he would later bring to war and diplomacy. And Claude, modest, quiet, marked by a curvature of the spine that made her gait uneven and her posture rigid, never glittered enough to hold his attention for long. Not when the court was full of women who sang like larks and danced like water, and not when his heart had already wandered to Françoise de Foix, a lady of the court whose elegance and wit would become the shadow against which Claude's silence was constantly measured. Yet Claude never protested. She never raised her voice. She never withdrew affection. She simply endured. Because she had been taught that duty was everything, that sacrifice was noble, that a queen did not bleed in public or cry behind doors that might one day be opened, and so she bore it all. The neglect, the humiliation, the knowledge that her body was useful only as long as it bore heirs. And in that bearing, she became not a wife, but a vessel. And the irony, cruel as it was, remained unspoken. The girl whom the court had once considered too frail, too plain, too insignificant, would go on to give birth to kings. Francis III, the Dauphin. Henry, the future King Henry II. And still, the father of those boys preferred his mistresses. Still, the court adored his lovers more than his queen. Still, Claude remained tucked away in Blois, far from the glittering festivities of the royal court, like a relic placed on a shelf too dusty to dust. No one thought to ask if she was happy. No one wondered if she had dreams. No one noticed that the girl who had once stood solemn at her wedding was now a young woman living in a castle of shadows, where every corridor echoed with footsteps not hers, where every tapestry hung over a wall she would never lean against for fear of breaking the image of composure she had been told to uphold since infancy. She became known as the Silent Queen, a monarch by name, but not by voice, a figurehead, not a figure of power. And when people spoke of her, if they did at all, it was with the tone one uses for a porcelain doll on a forgotten shelf, admiring in form, but empty of soul. Yet beneath the silence, there was a girl, still young, still breathing, still hoping, perhaps. But hope, like so many other things in her life, would be taken from her, slowly, one child at a time, one pain at a time, 1 year at a time. And still, she endured. Because Claude had not been raised to live. She had been raised to give, to be married, to be used, to be thanked politely, and then to be left behind. And in that abandonment, a tragedy bloomed quietly, like a bruise beneath lace, darkening with time, invisible to those who chose not to look. She wore a crown, but not the court's attention. When Francis I ascended the throne in 1515, barely 16 years old and already draped in the language of myth. Tall, handsome, with shoulders broad enough to carry a nation and a smile sharp enough to disarm his rivals, Claude, only 15 and newly named Queen of France, stepped into her role not as an empress of splendor, but as a symbol wrapped in velvet, celebrated in ceremony and forgotten in the very same breath. While her husband danced through the corridors of Amboise, Fontainebleau, and Chambord with poets, diplomats, and women who sparkled in candlelight and wore desire like perfume, Claude found herself quietly assigned to Blois, a grand yet distant residence where golden halls meant to dazzle felt instead like gilded cages, a palace whose silence grew thicker with each passing year, where the laughter of courtiers seldom echoed, and whose tapestries hung like woven reminders that even beauty, when seen alone, becomes a kind of imprisonment. She lived not as a consort beside her king, but as a cloistered monarch, a queen in title and exile, given no political influence, no presence in her husband's inner circle, no seat at the tables where decisions that shaped the world were made. Only the company of wet nurses, midwives, confessors, and the echo of footsteps that were always leaving her behind. And so Blois became her convent. And Claude, still young enough to blush, still fragile enough to tremble in winter, became what some whispered as the nun in purple, a queen wrapped in royal fabric but living the life of a recluse. Her hours divided between prayers whispered to saints who never answered, and letters that rarely received replies. Her nights spent staring out across the Loire River, its waters endless and uncaring, like the years she could already feel slipping quietly through her fingers. Francis, meanwhile, bathed in the Renaissance, positioning himself as the patron of arts and the new Caesar of Christendom, his court a flurry of philosophers, painters, mistresses, jesters, and ambassadors, all of whom orbited his sun-bright persona, while Claude remained invisible, his legal equal, yet his personal irrelevance, his partner in governance by title only, forgotten even as she birthed the very future of the dynasty. She did not attend the royal hunts, not because she wasn't invited, but because she was never asked. She did not dine at the feasts, not because she lacked appetite, but because she was not desired. And when Françoise de Foix, a brilliant, elegant court lady with quick wit and knowing eyes, became Francis's first and most prominent mistress, a woman he housed in luxury and praised in public, it was Claude who faded further into the background, a silhouette barely acknowledged, even as she walked hallways where portraits of past queens loomed above her like ghosts who had lived louder, loved better, or died more dramatically. No poetry was written for Claude. No court painter clamored to immortalize her. She was not a muse, not even a scandal. She was simply absent. And yet, she never abandoned her role, never rebelled, never lashed out or attempted to reclaim attention in a court that had decided she was uninteresting. Because Claude had been raised in the mold of sacrifice, conditioned to believe that obedience was holiness, that submission was strength, and that love, if not given, must still be endured. There is something infinitely tragic about a woman who accepts exile as duty. Each morning, she woke early, not to plan state matters or host audiences, but to pray, to oversee the education of her children, to write letters to her mother's old allies in Brittany, whom she barely remembered but still tried to honor, and to listen to the slow turning of time, each hour reminding her that youth was passing, that she was not being remembered as a queen, but merely used as one, And when she passed through the castle gardens, wrapped in furs even in spring, attendants noted that she never lingered by the fountains or stopped to admire the roses, that she walked as if always trying to keep warm, always a little hunched, always thinking of something that would never happen. They said her back was bent. They whispered that she limped slightly. They murmured about her silence like it was a sin. But none of them asked what her silence was trying to protect. Claude was not passive, only unheard. She advocated for charities in secret, supported poets in the shadows, funded churches without signing her name, and once defended a servant girl from being punished unjustly, not with anger, but with a look so sharp and cold, it froze even the steward's hand. There was strength, yes, but strength locked in a body trained to bow. She watched as other women, daughters of dukes, mistresses of noblemen, even the wives of foreign princes, moved with a kind of freedom she would never taste, speaking their thoughts boldly in court salons, wearing gowns slit at the thigh, arguing with bishops and jesting with kings, while she sat in the back of her own life, reading prayers and birthing heirs, like it was a penance she had signed for without knowing the price. And yet she loved her children. She loved them fiercely, protectively, perhaps even desperately. In their faces, she saw glimpses of her own worth reflected back, a validation that perhaps she was not invisible, not completely gone, because if the world would not remember Claude the Queen, then perhaps it would remember Claude the mother, the woman who raised a king, who taught Henry how to kneel before the altar and how to hold a sword without cruelty, who kissed her babies even when her body screamed in pain, even when her hands trembled with exhaustion. It was the only place she found meaning. In the nursery, not the throne room. And it is there, among the lullabies no one wrote down and the whispered prayers no one recorded, that her legacy begins to truly flicker. Soft, small, but unmistakably hers. But the flicker, like all candlelight left unattended, would not last long. Because Claude was not built for endurance, only for function. And a body that functions without love eventually begins to fail. And so, behind the high walls of Blois, in a palace dressed in silence, a queen was living and dying at once. It began, as it always did for queens, with celebration. Quiet at first, a whisper among ladies in waiting, a glance exchanged in the chapel, a hand resting on her stomach with both fear and fulfillment. And then louder, an announcement in the royal household that Queen Claude was blessed again, a phrase that fluttered through the corridors like gold leaf, fragile and shimmering, but never quite settling in the places where Claude herself lived, where joy was quickly replaced by fatigue and hope by responsibility. Her first child was born in 1518, when she was just 18, a boy Francis, Dauphin of France, whose tiny hands would one day hold the expectations of a kingdom. But in that moment clung only to a world he did not yet understand, a world that celebrated his birth while forgetting the woman who had bled to bring him into it. It was a long labor. She was small-framed, with hips not made for the repetition that followed. And still, it began again. Another child, then another, 7 in total, in 9 years. Each pregnancy announced with joy, each delivery endured in agony, each recovery shorter than the last, until recovery was no longer expected at all. Claude's body became not a temple, but a battlefield, one where no wars were declared, no enemies identified, no victories celebrated, and yet losses accumulated with each birth. The loss of energy, the loss of shape, the loss of rest, the loss of something unnamed that slowly ebbed away from her fingers, her skin, her spine, her smile. And in the courts of Europe, where queens were measured not by their intelligence or political influence, but by their ability to reproduce, Claude was considered successful, more than successful, a triumph, a symbol of dynastic strength, a living vessel of legitimacy. And yet, no one asked how she felt when the pains began weeks early, when the blood soaked her sheets too quickly, when the fever rose and the light in her eyes dulled, when her midwives looked at one another not with joy, but with worry. There were no modern physicians at her side, no anesthetics, no sterilized instruments, no privacy, only linen sheets soaked through, only candlelight that flickered and revealed too much, only hands, strangers' hands, pulling and pressing and praying while she clenched her jaw and wept into the pillow. And between those births, there was no time to heal, no time to walk without dizziness, no time to remember her own name, only titles. Her Majesty, the mother of the Dauphin, the Queen Consort. She was not a woman. They had erased that already. She was a womb, a symbol, a machine wrapped in velvet and pearl. Expected to smile when presented with a son and prepare again for the next just weeks later. By the time Henry, her second surviving son and future king, was born, Claude's spine had begun to curve further, her posture no longer the straight silhouette expected of a queen, but a slow folding into herself, as if her body had grown tired of being upright beneath so many demands, as if it longed to rest, but was denied even that. The palace at Blois, once merely cold, became suffocating, not because of its walls, but because of what they contained. The sound of crying children she was too weak to nurse, the scent of medicines she could no longer distinguish, the endless footsteps of attendants who moved around her like she was already fading, their kindness tinged with pity, their voices always lowered in her presence as if speaking too loudly might remind her she was slipping away. And Claude knew it, felt it in her bones, in her gums, in her temples that throbbed without end, in her teeth that ached from calcium loss, in her hands that trembled when holding a quill, in her reflection that she no longer recognized. There were days she could not rise from bed, days when her room had to be darkened, when meals went untouched, when she whispered only prayers, not because she believed they would be answered, but because it was the only thing left that was hers. The court called it female weakness, a vague term, a convenient one that blamed her biology while dismissing her suffering. But it wasn't weakness. It was depletion. It was slow, organized erosion. Each child carved a piece from her. Each labor took a year from a life that had barely begun. Each cry of a newborn was both joy and tolling bell. And Francis, her husband, her king, did not notice. Or if he did not care. He visited rarely. He lingered never. He wrote no letters of affection. He sent no paintings of her likeness. His heart was elsewhere, still caught in the perfume of mistresses, still dancing in the halls of Amboise, still drunk on the attention of foreign dignitaries who praised his virility, his politics, his poetry, while never once asking about the queen who had borne him heir after heir, until her blood no longer clothed her veins, but soaked the mattress beneath her. No poetry was written for her pain, no songs for her sacrifice, only silence, and another birth, and another, until even her maids whispered that her face had grown pale like paper, her fingers bent like branches, her waist vanished beneath layers of wool, not from modesty, but from collapse. She was 24. She had given birth to 7 children. And she was dying, not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of years that no one counted. And the cruelest part was not that she suffered. It was that she did so obediently, without rebellion, without scream, without accusation, because Claude had been taught that queens serve, that mothers sacrifice, that women endure. But she was still a girl, and no girl should die from being too good at what the world expects her to be. There are illnesses that scream through the body like fire, fevers that convulse, wounds that gush, pains that twist the spine and force even kings to bow. And then there are illnesses that do not shout but whisper, that do not arrive like storms but sink in like shadows, quiet and slow. Until one day the person you knew is no longer standing, no longer speaking, no longer able to rise from their bed. And all that remains is a shape beneath the sheets and the echo of what they once were. Claude of France did not die all at once. She eroded. Her body, weakened by endless childbirths and sleepless nights, began to betray her not through one great collapse, but through 1,000 small failures. A soft ache in the lower back that never subsided, a fatigue that wrapped around her arms like lead, a pain in the hips that made walking unbearable, a shortness of breath that came even while sitting still, a grayish tint to the skin that no makeup could mask and no physician could name. Her maids whispered of it first, the way she seemed to float rather than walk, the way she flinched when touched, the way her smile, always gentle, had started to disappear entirely, leaving only a hollow softness in her eyes, as if she were apologizing for still being here, for taking up space, for breathing. By the time she turned 23, Claude had become a ghost in her own home. Pale and silent, her spine more curved than ever, her eyes dulled by chronic exhaustion. She spent her days lying beneath thick velvet covers in a room that was always too cold, surrounded by the scent of lavender meant to cover the stench of infection. Because it was not just fatigue now, but something deeper, darker, festering silently inside her womb. A postpartum infection, perhaps? Though they did not call it that, because they did not have the words or did not wish to find them. The court simply said she was delicate. The doctors said she needed rest. The priests said her suffering was divine. And the king, he said nothing. She bled, but no one wrote it down. She trembled, but no one held her hand. She cried, but only at night, when the candles had been blown out and her attendants had retreated, and the stone walls could safely absorb the sound without letting it escape. There were no urgent treatments, no foreign surgeons summoned, no medicinal experiments, no courtly panic. Just resignation, just stillness. And in that stillness, Claude waited for her strength to return, even as it drained further each day, waited for her husband to visit, even as the carriage tracks led to other palaces, waited for the nausea to fade, for the fevers to cool, for the aching to subside, but none of it ever did. And slowly, she began to understand that her body had been spent entirely in the service of others, and there was nothing left for herself, not even enough to stand without leaning, not even enough to lift a child without pain. Her ladies-in-waiting began to notice a smell, faint at first, then stronger. A mixture of dried sweat, stagnant blood, and something deeper, something rotten. They changed her sheets twice daily. They poured rose water into her bath. They held lavender beneath her nose when guests approached. But Claude no longer had guests. She no longer appeared in chapel. She no longer walked through the garden. She was confined, not by law, but by her own failing flesh. And the court, so quick to flatter when she was pregnant, so full of praise when her sons were born, now shifted its gaze toward fresher faces, livelier women, newer queens in waiting, leaving Claude behind like a wilted bouquet in an empty room, once beautiful, now too painful to admire. The sickness had no name, and so they did not fear it. They simply moved on. Francis did not sit at her bedside. He did not cancel his travels. He did not write her letters of comfort. He had given her purpose. She had fulfilled it. And now that her purpose had consumed her, he looked elsewhere for joy, for warmth, for conversation, for beauty. But Claude, for all her frailty, still noticed everything. She saw the glances her maids exchanged. She heard the shuffle of feet in the hallway, slowing near her door but never entering. She tasted the bitterness of the tonics they gave her, and knew they would not help. She watched her reflection change. Less woman, more wax doll. And she began, quietly, to let go. There were no dramatic outbursts, no royal proclamations of final wishes, no teary farewells, no great artistic last acts, only small things. A prayer whispered not for herself, but for her children. A letter to a cousin, unsigned. A request that her window be left open, even in the rain. A single ring removed from her finger, placed on the nightstand like a final punctuation mark. Her last weeks were spent in bed, propped up by cushions that no longer supported her fully, her skin pale as candle wax, her breathing shallow, her fingers curled inwards as if clinging to something no one else could see. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was soft and slow, barely louder than the breeze from the Loire. Her eyes, once gentle, were now distant, as if she were already remembering a place she hadn't yet gone. They did not call it death. They called it rest, a long rest, a queen in need of sleep, a woman who had done her duty and would now recover. But deep down, everyone knew. Even the stone walls of Blois seemed to brace themselves. Because Claude was not ill. She was ending. And no one, not her husband, not her court, not her chroniclers, would admit that what was ending was not just her life, but the very embodiment of how a woman could be broken in service of a crown that never once paused to wonder if the price was too high. She was not a name anymore, not a voice, not even a story, just a body in a bed, a body they had used, a body they could not heal, a body they would bury. And with that body, the silence of centuries would begin. When the body fails and the world forgets, there is one place left for the soul to go. And Claude of France, once dressed in silks, once paraded as the daughter of dynasties, once crowned and celebrated and praised for her fertility and her obedience, now found herself retreating inward, slipping quietly away from the noise of courts and the weight of expectations. Building, within the cold stone of Blois, a chapel of the mind where no one else was allowed to enter, a sanctum of whispered prayers, of silent reckonings, of questions she never dared ask aloud, and of sorrows too vast to be uttered in the human tongue. Her room had grown darker, not because the curtains had been drawn, but because she no longer wished for light, not the harsh golden light of royal processions, not the flickering torchlight of endless ceremonies, but the soft, uncertain light of candles placed in corners where shadows were welcome and time felt slower, where every breath echoed louder than words and every prayer seemed to rise like smoke into a heaven she wasn't sure was listening. She prayed not for healing. She prayed not for love. She prayed not even for her children. She prayed for stillness, not peace. because peace suggests resolution, and Claude had long accepted that her story would not find closure. But stillness, the kind that comes when the last thread has been pulled, when the tapestry has unraveled entirely, and there is nothing left to be mended, nothing left to be done, nothing left to carry. Each morning began with the slow ritual of survival. The maids would bathe her frail limbs with cloth soaked in warm water and rose oil. Her hands would be gently uncurled, her lips touched with a linen-wrapped tincture that tasted of rust and honey. And while they murmured among themselves, discussing the day's news from court, or the queen's silence, or the fact that she no longer responded when addressed, Claude kept her eyes fixed on the crucifix above her bed, not out of devotion, but out of habit. Because if she stared long enough, maybe the world would vanish into that wooden figure too. Maybe the pain would shrink into something she could name. Maybe God would finally speak, or at least send someone who would. She was never without her rosary. Even when her fingers trembled, even when the beads slipped from her grasp, she insisted it remain with her, clutching it like a child might cling to a doll, not because it comforted her, but because it was the last thing that still connected her to herself. A rhythm, a pattern, a tactile memory of structure in a life that had been chaotic, imposed, and always out of her control. She whispered Hail Marys, not to the Virgin, for mercy, but because it was the only voice she had left that did not echo into emptiness. Outside her room, the world continued. Francis Maffei feasted with foreign envoys, rode through forests with courtiers, composed love letters to Anne de Pisseleu, and gave performances of learned patronage that would later earn him the title of France's first Renaissance king. While Claude, in a tower removed from the music and firelight, lay listening to the distant sound of hooves on gravel and wondered, without bitterness, what it felt like to matter in that way. To be longed for, not as an heir maker, but as a human. To be remembered not because you died, but because you lived. And yet, she did not hate him. She couldn't. Perhaps because she had never really known him, never truly been allowed to. He had been assigned to her as she had been assigned to him, and the rituals of monarchy had kept them apart even while marriage bound them together. He had given her children, yes, and his name and the illusion of partnership. But not once had he sat with her when the fever climbed. Not once had he pressed her hand when the birth pains turned to screams. Not once had he looked at her like she was a woman rather than a duty. And yet, she remembered his laugh. It had echoed once down a corridor in Blois when they were still teenagers, newly married and still awkward around one another. And he had seen a jester fall from a stool and burst into laughter, so full and unrestrained that even Claude, watching from the shadowed edge of the room, had smiled without meaning to. And she remembered that smile now, not as a wound, but as proof that something in her had once stirred, once responded, once flickered. It was not love, but it was close to it. And in her solitude, even that flicker mattered. She no longer wrote letters. She no longer received visitors, save for the occasional confessor, who came more out of obligation than urgency, and who spoke to her in soft tones, as if she were already dead, and any loud word might disturb the sanctity of her final weeks. He asked her once if she had any sins to confess. She looked at him for a long time, then shook her head. Because what sin could she name? To have given too much? To have spoken too little? To have obeyed so well that she disappeared? No, she had no sin. But she carried the weight of other people's decisions. And that, she knew, was heavier than any transgression of her own. She began sleeping during the day and waking in the evening, finding comfort in the darkness in the quiet hours when no one knocked, when the halls were still, when the stars were just visible beyond the frosted glass. Stars she once read about in poems but never studied. Stars that now felt closer to her than anyone in court, than anyone who had ever bowed before her and called her queen. She sometimes dreamed of water, a river, a sea, a baptism that washed her clean of everything, her title, her name, her duties, her children, her pain, and left her only with breath, only with silence, only with herself. And when she woke, she would cry, not loudly, not wildly, just a tear or two, enough to remind herself that she was still human. No one saw these tears. No one recorded them. They did not make it into the chronicles, because Claude's grief was not dramatic enough to survive in stories. But it was real, and it was hers. And in those final days, when all that remained were prayers, shadows, and the slow ticking of hours measured not by clocks, but by pain, Claude lived not as a queen, but as a girl, quietly preparing to leave a world that had never waited for her to catch up. In the summer of 1524, as the Loire River slipped past the stone walls of Blois with its usual indifference, a young queen, only 24, lay fading into the folds of a bed she had come to know better than any throne, surrounded not by courtiers or royal physicians or grieving family, but by linen and shadows and the soft rustling of servants who moved with the hushed reverence of those who understood that the person before them was dying, but that her death would not interrupt history. Claude of France, queen consort to Francis I, mother of 7, daughter of a duchess and a king, was not expected to die. She was expected to recover, to rest, to disappear into another long convalescence as she had done so many times before. Her decline so quiet, so slow, so thoroughly normalized that when she failed to rise one morning and could no longer speak above a whisper, the court still sent no messengers, summoned no urgency, prepared no mourning. Instead, news was sent to Francis that his wife was fatigued, not gravely ill, not near death, just tired. He did not come. He did not write. He remained in Fontainebleau, distracted by court affairs and the attentions of Anne de Pisseleu, his new mistress, whose presence now defined the center of the court as Claude's diminished form was quietly erased from it, so thoroughly that even her final days passed beneath notice, as if her body, too, understood that it must exit without spectacle, without burden, without expectation of lamentation. There were no priests waiting beside her bed with oils for anointing, no royal midwife attending to her comfort, though her illness had begun after yet another childbirth. No husband watching over her with folded hands, only maids who had long since learned to say nothing when her breath turned shallow. The chamber had no music, no visitors, no fresh flowers. It smelled of lavender, old milk, sweat, and sickness. It was July. The air was heavy, and the tapestries could not stop the warmth from pressing into the skin like a second fever. Claude's breath was thin, her skin damp, her mouth slightly parted, her fingers twitching as if still reaching for something. Perhaps a child? Perhaps the rosary that had slipped from her grip earlier that morning. Perhaps nothing at all. She died on July 20th, 1524, before sunrise. The candles were still burning. The linen was soaked at the collar. No one cried. No cannon salute marked the passing of the queen. No black flags were raised. No edicts of mourning were issued by the king. The silence that had accompanied her life returned once more to collect its debt. Later that day, when her death was finally acknowledged, the court's reaction was restrained, more administrative than emotional. Arrangements were discussed in muted tones. and the title of Queen Consort was already being reimagined for future ceremonial introductions. Not out of disrespect, but because her absence had already been assumed, rehearsed, even prepared for by years of neglect. Francis, upon receiving the news, did not hasten to her side. He did not bring their sons to see her body. He did not ride to Blois in black. He remained distant, not because he hated her, but because he had already moved on. So completely that even grief would have felt like a disruption, an inconvenience, a reminder of a life he had long since stepped beyond. Claude's body was washed, anointed in modest oils, and wrapped not in imperial cloth, but in the plain white linen of royal funerary tradition. The ritual was efficient, respectful, and devoid of extravagance. No marble tomb was ordered, no sculptor commissioned, no mausoleum planned in her honor. Her remains were taken to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where the kings and queens of France were buried. But even in death, she was not placed at the center. She was entombed in a modest space, near her children, far from court. There was no grand funeral. No throng of mourners lined the roads. No weeping widow. No memorial sermons echoing through the cathedrals. Her passing, like her presence, was quiet. The chronicles of the time recorded her death in a few lines. They listed her titles. They counted her children. They noted the date. But they did not mention the long decline, the spinal curvature, the blood that stained her bed sheets, the slow suffocation of a body asked to do too much too soon, the infection that began in the womb and spread outward like a curse unspoken. There was no posthumous glorification, no campaign to preserve her memory. The court simply continued. The affairs of state moved forward. Anne de Pisseleu rose higher in influence. The role of queen was repopulated, if not formally, then socially. Claude's name began to disappear from daily discourse, still printed on official records, but rarely spoken with warmth, rarely written with reverence. And though she had given birth to kings, Francis III, Henry II, Madeleine of Valois, she was remembered not as their mother, but as the necessary passage through which they had arrived. No paintings were commissioned in the years following her death. No court poet composed verses in her memory. No commemorative coin bore her face. She vanished from memory as efficiently as she had vanished from court, absorbed into the lineage without ever being celebrated by it. A name preserved only in archives, her likeness surviving only in faded sketches, her voice left unrecorded, her soul left unaddressed. She had reigned, but she had never ruled. She had birthed, but she had never spoken. And when she died, she left behind no scandal, no myth, no unfinished war, no rebellion, only a life that had given everything and received nothing in return but silence. Not even history wept. Not even history paused. And in that stillness, her tragedy was complete. In the days that followed her burial, the dust on the roads to Saint-Denis had barely settled when the rhythms of court resumed, as if the queen had never died at all. Francis the youthful, resplendent, and already practiced in the art of forgetting, turned his gaze away from Blois with the same casual grace with which he had turned away from her bedside. And the machinery of monarchy, relentless in its appetite, replaced her name with new pleasures, new titles, new alliances before her grave had grown cold. There was no year of mourning, no black garb beyond the obligatory ceremonies, no royal decree preserving her memory, no vow of absence made in her honor. Francis had lost a wife, yes, but he had not lost a companion. He had lost the mother of his children, but not the woman he loved, because love had never lived between them. and her absence left no wound that could not be sutured by another smile, another banquet, another woman with clever hands and practiced laughter. Anne de Pisseleu, a lady-in-waiting with eyes quick enough to read the room and lips quick enough to rewrite her place within it, stepped into the vacuum before anyone could name it, not as queen, for no such title would ever be granted, but as consort in everything but legal form, a woman who laughed where Claude had remained quiet, who played music where Claude had prayed, who stood at Francis's side not because it was her duty, but because she knew how to hold his attention like a flame fed with oil. The transition was seamless. Claude's tapestries were replaced. Her letters were boxed. Her chambers were aired and reassigned. There was no reluctance in the change, no ceremonial hesitation, no collective breath held to honor the dead. It was as if the court had been waiting for her to vanish, as if her role had ended years before her body surrendered to the decay that finally claimed it. Saint-Denis, though sacred, did not raise her in memory. Her tomb was modest, placed beside her children, unadorned with sculpted likeness or heraldic triumph, carved with minimal inscription, just enough to confirm her lineage, just enough to ensure the genealogical record remained intact, but not enough to evoke mourning, not enough to summon legacy. She was buried as a queen, but not remembered as one. Her image was not engraved in stained glass. Her story was not taught to future dauphins. Her name was not spoken in court festivals. Even in the homes of her children, her absence became background. Francis III, still a boy, was sent to be raised in royal academies, where the mention of his mother was made only in passing, a footnote beneath the weight of his future. Henry, the second son, would grow into a king who rarely referenced her except in matters of bloodline, as if she were more dynasty than mother, more obligation than origin. Only the youngest children, too young to understand, remembered the warmth of her lap or the shape of her hand, but even those memories, soft as petals, would one day blur, displaced by portraits of new queens, new women, new mothers who arrived not with the bloodied hands of childbirth, but with the assurance of influence. In letters and archives, her name dwindled. She became Claude, consort. She became Claude, daughter of Louis XII. She became Claude, mother of Henry. She was not Claude the faithful, not Claude the ill, not Claude the endured. Her achievements, 7 children, alliances maintained, lineage secured, were acknowledged, but not admired. They were expected, and expectation rarely earns praise. What she gave was already owed. What she endured was already discounted. Francis's memory, curated by poets and historians who adored his patronage of the arts, celebrated his military conquests, his chivalric persona, his Renaissance soul, but rarely paused to acknowledge the woman who bore his heirs and died unseen. She became background, she became context, and in being reduced to context, she was erased. The court artists painted other women. The royal jewelers set stones for other necks. The chapel prayers, offered for the health of the royal family, no longer included her name. Even the clerks who preserved royal documents adjusted their language, rewriting recent history as if the Queen's death had been a seasonal inconvenience, an inevitable chapter closed with quiet politeness. And yet, the effects of her presence lingered, quietly, invisibly. The Dauphin carried the shape of her mouth. Henry carried her solemn temperament. Madeleine, in her brief life, inherited Claude's fragility. But these echoes were never traced back to her. Even as generations unfolded, even as portraits of her children adorned palace halls, the woman who had given them life was no longer present, not in narrative, not in celebration, not even in whispered recollection. What remained was functional memory, not emotional memory. She had served. She had done her duty. And when the duty was done, she was removed. Efficiently, completely, like a dress retired from the season, folded and stored where no one thought to look again. The bitter truth was not that she had died young. It was that her youth had been used up so precisely, so thoroughly, that by the time she passed, the court had already forgotten what it had once demanded from her. They had taken everything, body, blood, time, dignity, and left no space for her soul to remain. Even the chroniclers, loyal to the crown, offered no reflection. They wrote her out with clean hands. They turned the page. And history, with its infamous appetite for kings and battles and rebellions, did not hunger for a queen who had asked for nothing, who had fought for nothing, who had only borne pain and kept it quiet. And so Claude of France faded, not in scandal, not in disgrace, not in fire or tragedy, but in silence so profound it was indistinguishable from dismissal. She gave the crown 2 kings. She received no monument in return. She left behind no grand statue, no tower bearing her name, no illuminated manuscript chronicling her reign, no enduring myth embroidered with false glory or tragic romance. What remained of Claude of France, after death had closed its hands around her slender frame, was not carved in stone nor immortalized in cathedral glass, but instead emerged in quieter, stranger, subtler ways, surviving not in the annals of power, but in the margins, the overlooked corners where memory lingers, not through force but through gentleness. One of those remnants was a fruit, a small round plum, green-skinned, soft-fleshed, sweet with a trace of tartness, cultivated during her lifetime in the royal orchards and named in her honor as Reine Claude, a name that outlived her in the mouths of farmers and chefs, gardeners and merchants. Long after it had been dropped from royal ceremony, a name whispered at markets and printed on parchment menus centuries later, surviving through harvests when her children's monuments had already begun to weather and crumble. No decree established it. No royal gardener wrote a treatise. No official story crowned the plum as her legacy. It simply remained. Each bite, whether tasted in summer kitchens or woven into late August desserts, carried the trace of her title. Not her sorrow, not her silence, not her royal grief, but her name, distilled into something that nourished instead of consumed, that offered pleasure instead of expectation, that did not demand anything from those who received it. The irony, of course, was unmissable. A queen who died from being asked to give too much of herself was remembered through a fruit that gives effortlessly, season after season, without fanfare, without pain. It was, in some ways, the most fitting memorial, unofficial, humble, persistent. There were other fragments too, though fainter. A few verses, unsigned, tucked into a collection of poems discovered centuries later in a provincial archive. Likely penned by a courtier too low in rank to publish them openly, yet too haunted by her stillness to remain fully silent. A poem that spoke not of her crown or her titles, but of a bird in velvet who sings to no one, and a garden where the queen is the only thing not in bloom. Words that suggested quiet observance, words that hinted at what could not be said directly in a time when to notice a queen's suffering was to critique the king's indifference. No one could prove the poem was about Claude. It bore no date, no signature, no royal clue. But it floated through literary circles long enough to be associated with her. And in that association, it offered a strange kind of dignity, not fame, not vindication, but a recognition that someone, at some point, had seen her. even if they had dared not speak her name aloud. Her name also endured in genealogy books, of course, recorded neatly in tables and lineages, her children's births tracked with precision, her marriage to Francis listed as one of political necessity and dynastic success. But these references, though historically accurate, did not carry her spirit, did not trace the shape of her suffering, did not consider the cost of what was achieved through her. And thus, though her name was preserved, her presence was lost. In portraits of her sons, particularly Henry, there are shadows of her. The downward turn of the mouth, the long lashes over thoughtful eyes, the quiet stillness that sometimes haunted his expression when he was not in motion, not on horseback, not holding a weapon. But these features were never publicly linked to her character, only to their royal blood, only to their father's strength, never to the woman who endured labor after labor to deliver them. No chapel was built in her memory. No annual requiem was sung. No statue placed in the gardens of Versailles. No stained glass in Notre Dame bore her likeness. The palace at Blois retained her name only in whispers. Her old bedchamber was redecorated, her favorite books scattered, her rosary taken by a nun who left no diary. And yet, within certain monastic circles, particularly among the cloistered communities she quietly supported during her life, prayers continued to be whispered for her soul. Not officially, not with Mass, but in the private devotion of nuns who remembered her letters, her small donations, her silent acts of piety, her whispered requests for intercession during the years when no one else was listening. They prayed for her not because she had been a great queen, but because she had suffered like one of them. They did not record her suffering in ledgers. They carried it in memory. She was not venerated, but she was remembered in moments, in fruit, in prayer, in an unnamed poem, in the face of a son, in a single line in a baptismal record that once read, "Born of Claude." There is something haunting about a legacy so unintentional. No monument was meant to last. No portrait was meant to endure. No story was meant to be told. Yet traces remain, not enough to fill a book, but enough to feel her absence. Because what Claude of France left behind was not a dynasty, not a legend, but a question. How many women gave everything to the machinery of empire, and were thanked only with the silence of its gears? The fruit endures. The children ruled. The court moved on. But somewhere, between a forgotten chapel and a harvest orchard, between an anonymous verse and a plum's soft skin, her name still breathes, not loudly, not heroically, not insistently, but enough to remind those who care to notice that she was here. She was human, and she once gave everything to a world that refused to remember her in full. Claude of France was never meant to become a tragedy. Not in the operatic sense, not in the grand Shakespearean way where queens fall with kingdoms and die with declarations on their lips. Her tragedy was quieter, older, and infinitely more familiar. A tragedy written in long silences, in overlooked glances, in the slow undoing of a life spent being useful instead of being loved. She was married at 14, pregnant before her body was ready, and dead at 24, after giving birth to 7 children, after being abandoned by her husband, after being reduced to a name beneath a signature. No war took her. No scandal destroyed her. No rebellion made her immortal. She was simply erased by the very institution she was built to serve. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all. As the narrator of this story, I find myself circling back to the same image. Claude, curled in a velvet-draped bed, too young to be dying, too old to still be waiting for affection. With the sound of a child crying somewhere down the corridor, and no one there to tell her that it was okay to rest. She didn't choose the crown. She didn't even choose the marriage. She was born with expectations stitched into her bones, with history's hunger whispering in her cradle, with her mother's ambition and her father's desperation balancing like weight on either shoulder. And through it all, she did what was asked. She was obedient. She was loyal. She was generous. And for that, she was buried in silence. What strikes me most is not that she was forgotten. History forgets many. What haunts me is that it was a chosen forgetting, a deliberate folding of her story into the margins, as if her suffering was too ordinary to matter, as if her endurance was too predictable to be worth remembering, as if her humanity was too inconvenient for a narrative that favored the glory of kings and the spectacle of power. Claude did not fail. She did not break her vows. She did not rebel. She simply disappeared, and the world called it natural. But there was nothing natural about what happened to her. It is not natural for a girl to become a wife before she understands her own voice. It is not natural for a woman's worth to be measured by how many children her body can withstand. It is not natural for a queen to be used, ignored, and then replaced like a ceremonial garment. And it is not natural to die alone, having given everything, and be remembered only through a plum and a prayer. So what then do we do with Claude? We remember her, not as a queen, not as a consort, not as a mother of kings, but as a person. We remember her as a girl who loved quietly, as a woman who endured nobly, as a human being who deserved more than duty. Because when we look past the crown, past the lineage, past the silent footnotes in royal genealogies, we find something universal in Claude's story, something that speaks to every woman who has ever been asked to give more than she should, to smile while she breaks, to endure while no one is watching. Claude was not weak. She was erased. And now, centuries later, we speak her name not to mourn her royalty, but to reclaim her existence. Because in the end, that's all history ever is. A battle between what is remembered and what is allowed to be forgotten. Let Claude be remembered, not for her crown, but for her cost. If you found meaning in Claude's story, a queen whose silence tells us more than the victories of kings, subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Here, we don't glorify the crowns. We unveil the shadows they leave behind. Click subscribe and help us give voice to the forgotten. Because history, when told right, is not about triumph. It's about truth.